Okay, this is a screencast basically to kind of take you through what we went through in lab on the first day for that lab that we couldn't have because the building was out without power. So next week in lab, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be going out into the field and you're going to be making observations. And if we just turned you loose in the field without any sort of preparation for that, you would make a series of observations that would probably not be particularly useful in building questions out of those observations. And so what we found a number of years ago is that if we could somehow kind of get everybody on the same page in terms of the way that we're thinking about organisms before you go out into the field, um, we could actually have a more productive time in the field. And so that's what the kind of the first week in lab is for. The other thing that we would do in the first week of lab is we would put you in groups and have you get to know one another a little bit. So I've posted the groupings, the different groups on the Moodle site. So go there, find your groups, and when you first convene to work on this exercise as homework for this coming week, what I want you to do is I want you to share your name, your hometown, um, any kind of extracurricular activities that you might be involved in, and whatever your guilty pleasure is. And that use that as kind of a way to sort of break the ice and get to know one another a little bit. The other thing that I'm going to ask you to do at the end of your work is as you work on this, keep in mind who's contributing and who's not contributing. And at the end of the class period, I'm going to ask you to send, at the end of the period of you working together, I'm going to ask each of you to send me an email with all the other members of your group's names in that email, and then a rating from 1 to 5 as to how you feel they worked with the group, 5 being working very well, 1 being working not very well. There's this habit we're going to get into in terms of evaluating our performance and evaluating the performance of our peers. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just something that you might have to get used to a little bit. So everybody work hard on what comes ahead, and everything will be fine. So what we want you to be thinking about as you go out into the field is we want you to be making observations, but we want you to be placing those observations in the context of the kinds of challenges that organisms are faced with. And over the years, we've kind of come up with seven fundamental challenges, and we've made these kind of broad enough that they're broad encompassing things, and you could apply them to any group of taxa. You could apply them to fungi, you could apply them to bacteria, you could apply them to plants, animals, whatever. And these categories are basically all organisms need to acquire energy. This is usually in the form of carbon-containing compounds. Another thing that animals are going to have to do is they're going to have to acquire nutrients. You might think that nutrients and energy go together, but when we think of nutrients, we're thinking about things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, things like that, as opposed to carbon, which is the atom that we normally associate with energy transfer. Organisms also have to maintain water balance. You have to get enough water to survive, and you need to avoid too much water such that it negatively affects you. You also have to maintain adequate temperature balance, so we might think of this as thermal homeostasis. This is something that challenges all organisms, and the smaller the organism you are, the more challenged you are by it. So that's 4. Let's see, what are the other ones? Maintaining homeostasis. Oh, in the same way that organisms are trying to acquire energy, other organisms are trying to avoid becoming energy for something else. So avoiding predation or parasitism. Either one of these would be kind of categorized the same. As a matter of fact, the way we mathematically model parasitism is the same way that we model predation. Most organisms need what we refer to as shelter. For animals, that might actually involve a physical structure like a nest or a burrow or something like that. In the case of plants, it's all about where they happen to be living. Do they have the correct microenvironment for plants to live in? What are those microenvironments, and how do plants get there? Might be a set of questions that you could ask about this. And then the last thing that organisms ultimately need to do is they need to reproduce. If organisms are not reproducing, then essentially the species will ultimately go extinct. So these are 7 kind of fundamental things that organisms need to do on a regular basis, in some cases on a daily basis, in order to survive to the point that they are old enough to reproduce. And then once they get to reproductive age or reproductive stage, they need to be able to reproduce. And so what we want you to do is to have these kind of fundamental needs in your mind when you go out into the field, but just having these isn't actually sufficient, because as we know, animals are very different, for example, from plants. And so the way in which, for example, plants might acquire energy is very different from the way in which animals might acquire energy. And so when we think about acquiring energy, we might have to think about acquiring energy for plants as different from acquiring energy for animals. And so what we would do with you in lab, once again, had we been meeting in person, is we would have started going through this process of sort of decomposing each of these things. And what we're going to do, just here in my office, is I'll go through one of these with you and kind of get you started on how we want you to concept map these ideas. And so let's just stick with acquiring energy. You're going to ultimately do this for all 7 of these as a group, but let's just start with acquiring energy. Well, on the plant side of things, plants generally acquire energy through photosynthesis. We're going to be talking quite a lot about photosynthesis in the second case study and lecture. We're not going to talk about it a lot right now. My green marker seems a little weak, so I'll get a new one. Well, photosynthesis requires a bunch of things. It requires carbon dioxide. It requires water. It requires a pigment called chlorophyll. So we can think about kind of what a plant needs in order to do photosynthesis, but we can also think about the different kinds of photosynthesis. We have C3 and C4 photosynthesis, which are 2 different ways of going about photosynthesis. We also have crassylation, acid metabolism as the 3 types. We could actually concept map this differently. We could actually say, well, there are different types of photosynthesis, or we could say there are different photosynthetic pathways, which is kind of the fancy pants way of saying this. And those photosynthetic pathways are C3, C4, and CAM, crassylation, acid metabolism. These are done by different groups of organisms. So for example, spinach and wheat and oak trees, those are all C3 plants. Corn and big blue stem and switchgrass and those things are C4 plants. And then a lot of your succulent groups, things like cacti, are crassylation, acid metabolism plants. So we can start to kind of think about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis involves carbon and water being combined to create glucose. You require chlorophyll. You also require enzymes like rubisco. Once again, we could graph this differently by saying it requires certain enzymes that are involved in the fixation of carbon. Some of these enzymes are rubisco, which is what we see both in C3 and C4 plants, but there's another enzyme called PEP carboxylase that is only in C4 plants. So there are a variety of ways in which you could go about doing this, and so you could continue filling this in, but that's kind of how you might go about doing this for plants. With animals tend to acquire energy by killing and eating other things. In some cases, animals are killing and eating other animals, and in some cases, animals are killing and eating plants. But in all ways, you could go through what's known as the predation sequence. And the predation sequence is something that we use in animal behavior to explain kind of the series of steps that an organism goes in to find prey. But you could also think about this from the same perspective if an animal is out seeking plants to eat as well. It's just that plants have a different set of counter adaptations than animals do. So in the predation sequence, we think about there's a search phase. You have to find the prey. You have to find the food that you're looking for. The second thing that you have to do is you have to recognize that prey is actually prey. So there's a search phase, there's a recognition phase. Once you've recognized that it's something worth going after, you have to capture it, gain control over it, but simply because you temporarily gain control over it doesn't mean that you ultimately kill and eat it. And so there's a final phase, which is called the handling phase, where after you've captured it, you proceed to be able to kill and eat it. This is a good productive way. They go in order. You can't recognize something before you search for it. You can't capture it until you've found it and recognized it. You can't handle it until you've captured it. But then for each of these things, predators may have particular adaptations that are useful for searching. So they might have good visual acuity. They might have good hearing and sense of smell. They might have memory of where their preferred prey hang out, such that they will go and they will selectively search in those areas. On the recognition side of things, a lot of times what helps with recognition is things like formation of a search image. To capture some prey item, you might have weapons of offense. Things like teeth and claws and things like this. And in terms of killing and handling, you might also have these weapons of offense, but you might also, for example, if you're something that preys on a toxic animal, you might have, for example, detoxification capacities that you have evolved over thousands or hundreds of thousands of generations of evolving with this prey. And we could fill this in. There's a book on animal behavior, behavioral ecology that I use in my animal behavior book. It goes through these things in great detail. And so once again, we can think about, well, what do animals have to do in order to acquire energy? Well, this is one way of thinking about that. It's not the only way of thinking about it, it's just one way of thinking about it. It's a way that I find productive in animal behavior. So as we go through all of this, we fill out one of these levels, but remember that there are 7 things that organisms have to do. So we might shift gears to another one of these, which is, for example, maintaining water balance or water homeostasis. In many cases, this is due to water being a scarce resource in many environments. It's less of an issue avoiding too much water, although you could also think of it in that way as well. And so when we think about maintaining water balance, plants get water primarily through their roots, and so certainly on the plant side, roots are involved. But that's the way of acquiring water, but we also have to think about how plants use water. So when plants absorb water, they send it to the leaves, basically. But then, while the plant does photosynthesis, it opens up its stomata to let carbon dioxide in. But when it opens up the stomata, these little holes, these little openings in the leaves, when it opens up the stomata to let carbon dioxide in, water evaporates out. Water leaves the leaf. And so you actually have water loss through the process of transpiration, which is ultimately due to the fact that the plant is going through photosynthesis. In the same way, once an organism once an animal has caught an organism, think about a desert tortoise out in a desert, it may choose its plants because the plants that it eats because they have the proper nutrients, but it may also choose plants because plants have what we refer to as preformed water. This is water that is just a part of the food that the animal eats. And so animals can also just drink, but of course in order to drink they have to find water in order to get it. But the preformed water actually comes from the food that they're eating. And so as you go through and fill in this tree of relationships of ideas about acquiring energy, when you get to another section of another one of these subheadings, think about not only what is involved at that level, but also think about how that level relates to other things that an animal or plant might have to be doing. And so the goal is for you to build by Tuesday when you come to lab, build out a complete concept map that tries to get your head thinking about the different things that organisms need to get by, and it gets you thinking about those things so that they're in your head, so that as you see an organism out there in nature, you can begin to ask questions or make observations about that organism in the context of thinking about its biology in a more formal way than you normally might. So let me get my notes out, and I'll post these notes on the Moodle site. But there are some things that I want you to do specifically in the process. What did I do with those notes? Well, let me pull them up on my computer. That might be easier. So homework for Tuesday: get together as your group, get to know one another, and work on building a concept map. You can use the concept mapping programs that Nathan introduced you to in lecture. I was playing around on my iPad just last night, and I found that there's this program that is on the Mac called Simple Mind. Actually is really pretty intuitive to use, and you can't see it in focus very well, but there's Simple Mind. There are a lot of different concept mapping or mind mapping programs that you can get both for your computer and for your iPad. I try and avoid anything that I actually have to pay for. So one thing you need to do is you need to bring a copy of that concept map, a printed copy of that concept map to lab. Not only that, you need to bring 5 copies for each person in the lab, and you need to bring 1 copy for me to turn in. The other thing that we want you to do for homework for Monday is, over the course of the time between now and Tuesday in lab, we want you to make 10 observations. And We talked about the nature of observations in class yesterday. We talked about different qualities of observations. So we want you to be making good observations of the natural world around you. And you can do this just as you're walking around campus, or if you take a walk at a park or something like that. Collect the observations at different times during the day because organisms will be doing different things during the day. For example, I have flowers in my yard that only bloom in the daytime, and at night they curl themselves up. I have other ones that only bloom at night, actually. So intersperse these observations throughout the day. Bring a list of 10 observations with you, once again printed out to turn in. And that's an individual assignment. Each of you will give me 10 different observations. And then on an individual level, I need you to write down 2 rules that you think would be good rules for how your group is going to function over the course of the semester. You can put those rules on the same sheet of paper that you have your observations. Just put them down at the bottom of your observations. And then the last thing is you need to send me a list of your other group members, basically telling me how you rated their contribution to the work of building the concept map. As you get ready for Tuesday. So that said, that kind of introduces you to the idea of concept mapping around these 7 categories that were on the board earlier. And I will see you tomorrow in class, and I will definitely see you Tuesday. Remember that we don't have class on Monday because of Labor Day, but we will still have lab on Tuesday. On Tuesday, come dressed to go into the field. So wear long pants, long sleeve shirts would be wise, good sturdy shoes. Don't show up in your shorts and your flip flops because that's going to make for a fairly uncomfortable morning for you if that's how you come attired. All right, so I will see you later.